Morning. Oh no.
He's like this. And so he was biting it and I went to pull it away and he went to go chomp again and
Oh.
I
Oof, oof, oof. Yeah, now that I think about it, it was fairly rare for me to get bitten or scratched when I volunteered. So, Simba has done it.
He thinks I'm just a giant cat. I'll be right back. I've got to grab my other notebook. And so he tries to get me to play with him like a cat. He doesn't understand that, like, if he sneaks up on me and tackles me, I'm not prepared. Cool.
I mean, there are more people online, but I think people in this version of this class, like, sort of check out on Fridays. But I'm glad for the 7 of you that are here. So welcome. We're going to start talking about intelligence stuff. So. Send it to you real quick, and then we will dive on in. Yeah, that's true. Yep, you should be fine. I had, so one of the places I worked in grad school, one of the psychiatry residents was a former ER doc, and she told us that like cat fights are one of the worst things when people come in. Yeah, because they're licking everything all the time, so they don't get the bacteria in their mouths.
Yep. And because their teeth are, you know, like the dog bites you, their canine teeth are fatter.
Right.
Versus cats are so pointy, they can push like whatever bacteria like way down to fit there.
Yeah.
And of course, he was like totally sad, like rubbing on me. Like,
Aw.
I'm sorry. Like, oh my God, I'm sorry.
Aw, that's very cat. Alrighty, so we're gonna start talking about intelligence tests. So today is kind of the background. Welcome, come on in. And so we're going to talk about theories of intelligence. So we're gonna start by doing an activity, and folks on Zoom, you can do this at home along with us. So go ahead and grab a piece of paper, or if you're on Zoom, feel free to like type on a Word document for yourself and draw a line down the middle of it. And on one column, think of 3 people you would characterize as intelligent. And write in that column all the distinctive qualities of those people. These could be people you know, or people who are like celebrities. You could think like Einstein, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Think about what are the qualities of people who are intelligent. And try to be, as much as you can, behavioral. So think about what are intelligent behaviors? How do people that act intelligent act, or that are intelligent act? And then on the other column, maybe not surprisingly, you're going to do for people who are unintelligent. Okay, so think of people you know, and again, could be a celebrity, could be a former president, who are unintelligent. And write in the right column, and don't write down their names, we don't need to know, especially not if it's someone you know. So take a couple minutes to do this, and then we're gonna write down those behavioral things. So think about how you might observe intelligence or unintelligence. And again, folks at home, feel free to join us as well.
Professor Myers,
Yeah.
does the unintelligent column have to be a specific person, or could it be?
Yeah, I mean, like I had said, think of like 3 people you know who are unintelligent, but if you can just think of examples, that's fine for either side.
Like for one of them, I was going to say materialist. for unintelligent? Or do you want an actual person?
Doesn't have to be a person, but yeah, think of like behaviors they do that make you realize they're unintelligent, if that makes sense.
Okay, so we named person and behaviors?
Yeah, I don't need to know who the person is. The person is
Okay.
just to help you think of the behaviors, basically.
Okay.
Righty. So take about another minute to wrap that up, and then we'll start talking these through. And if folks are at home, you can unmute like Troy just did, or you can write stuff in the chat. So if you want to start writing in the chat for your thoughts of behaviors that seem intelligent, you can feel free to start typing that up now, because I know that takes a minute. Alrighty, so let's start thinking these through. What were some behaviors folks came up with again, either folks on Zoom or folks here in class, for what is intelligent behavior? Yeah, Aaron.
I feel like this is all sort of a stereotype rather than smart people speak slower or
Mm.
use like a long pace. I think a lot of the time unintelligent people like bigger words. So like, I don't know, maybe we're just trying not to be fucking they always speed it up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that making intelligent kind of similarly can have good communication skills and able to just kind of debate with people without turning to insults and, and able to debate with good sources of whatever they're saying.
That makes sense. And then Elijah is saying qualities like open-mindedness and modesty. So how do we operationalize open-mindedness?
Willing to learn.
Yeah, willing to learn, or like listening to other people, maybe.
Critical thinker.
And then modesty, is sort of a not behavior, not bragging, I guess. All right, any other ones for intelligence? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, so not taking things at face value, maybe.
Questioning the facts.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Always learning,
Mhm.
researching things, and willing to absorb information.
Cool. All right, so how about folks that are unintelligent? What are some behaviors we see them do?
Sometimes like in my mind, it's like spreading information is that.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be a big one. Ooh. Right. Yeah, Steven. Oh, yeah, not listening to others. Yeah. Definitely.
People that ignore the facts. That's the definition of ignorant.
Yeah, yeah. Ignore the facts. Yeah, and like how they argue, maybe. I keep on trying to think of like how we could absorb it, right?
It seems like not willing to learn new things, not interested in, change.
Yeah, so not willing to learn new things. Maybe the way we operationalize this is just not researching, not learning, right? Yeah, so as we can see, we're starting to see sort of the opposite on the other side, which makes sense, right? And so you all have probably figured out by now, because you are intelligent people, right? Is that what I'm trying to get at is how do we measure intelligence, right? And, for measurement of something like this, it has to be something we can operationalize, right? It has to be something we can observe in some way. So maybe it is, observing people doing behaviors, or maybe it is observing people, if we're thinking about like emotional intelligence, interacting with other people, right? But we've got to think of ways to conceptualize that, measure it. And so for the next week or so, we'll be talking about all the different ways you can do that. And we're going to start today by talking more of the theory and the history behind it, which we've touched on at the beginning of the semester. And then we'll have like a mini lecture for each of the types of the assessments. And I have copies of most of them now, so I'll bring them in and we can look at them. And then probably next Friday-ish, y'all will give each other sections of something that's like an intelligence/neuropsych thing. So that will be where we start having people partner up and do that. So let me get this into presentation mode. Chat for now. There we go. So, theories of intelligence, right? As we saw just now, intelligence is a complex concept. It can feel a little elusive when we try to define it, right? Like, I don't know. And definitions have evolved over the years. And to be perfectly honest, there are still experts who disagree on what intelligence is. And there are different types of intelligences now. So there really is no single definition of intelligence that's universally accepted at this point in time, which makes it all the more complicated when we're trying to assess intelligence, right? So, I had a slide for that. Okay, so one of the first ways that they tried to measure intelligence was using a concept called mental age. So late in the 19th century, the 1800s, French investigators, Alfred Binet, Victor Henry, or Henri, and Theodore Simon, or Simon, focused on higher mental processes as key to understanding intelligence. So higher mental processes is how they defined intelligence, which like higher mental processes needs a definition in and of itself, right? But they didn't really do that. I mean, they did in their own way. So in 1905, they published the first practical intelligence test, which had items that ranked in order of difficulty as you went through. And so they would give this test to people and kind of see how they did on easy versus harder items. And the more people they gave it to, the more they were able to like get norms for different ages, essentially. And so they pioneered this concept of mental age, which was to provide a average performance of each age group. And then you sort of compared that person's score to like where they should be for their what we call chronological age. Chronological age is just how old you actually are, basically. So like you were born in X year, your chronological age is, our current year minus that year. Or sometimes they get pretty specific of like, 19 years, 5 months, or something like that. So the idea was you can look at people's mental age and say how they compare to people of their chronological age, right? Are they right where they're supposed to be? Their mental age matches their chronological age. Are they doing better? Or are they doing worse, right? And Binet, Henry, and Simon were most concerned about the people who were doing worse. They wanted to try to identify those kiddos and help them get essentially like remedial education so that they didn't fall too far behind. So in 1912, sort of going off of this concept of mental age, chronological age, in Germany, there was a researcher named Stern, last name Stern, who proposed the complex concept of intelligence quotient, or IQ. And we still obviously use that term today, but its meaning has evolved over the years. So the way that we talk about its meaning is very different than what I'm going to talk about right now, but we still use the term IQ, right? And so Stern believed that your intelligence quotient was essentially a ratio of your chronological age and your mental age, and that would give a numerical score that would allow you to interpret whether the participant was advanced. So, are they of higher IQ, average IQ, or they use terms like slow in relation to other children of the same age, of the same chronological age. So he came up with this formula where it was IQ is equal to, and there should be a parentheses around the fraction. So mental age divided by chronological age, and then you take that value and you multiply it by 100. So it's almost like a percentage in some ways, right? And so this was the idea of an IQ for years, and this is how they calculated IQ for years. So then we had Stanford psychologist Lewis Terman, and he embraced the concept of IQ. And so he took the tests that Binet and colleagues had developed in France and brought it over to the US, translated it, adapted it to American children. And then he took Stern's idea of the IQ and kind of added that on. So it was the French investigators were really only talking about mental age, and then they just sort of like compare it, like, oh, their mental age is 6, but their chronological age is 7, right? And it was Stern's idea to create this fancy quotient, right, based on it. So with the translation, the adaptation, using the IQ as part of the scoring, he developed what was called the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale. And so now we have this measure of intelligence in the US that can be used for kids, and then has this IQ, number that we can use as part of the scoring and use to compare people. So in 1927 in England, Charles Spearman proposed a 2-factor theory of intelligence. He believed that there was a general mental ability that was involved in all intelligent behavior. So all those behaviors we listed in our activity at the start of class on the intelligence side, Spearman would say those are all general intelligence, which he called the G factor. G for general intelligence. In addition, he proposed that there were likely one or more specific factors, or S factors, that could be involved in solving the items on existing intelligence tests. So we talked about this as like everybody has just like a general intelligence, but then there might be people who are better at specific subsets of them. And honestly, like this carries over in its own way today, that you can get a general IQ score, but then you can also look at different things. So, okay, we're starting to develop this theory. There is not just one type of intelligence. So then people started thinking about it even more. And so the 60s, really through the 70s in American psychology, and turned into worldwide as well, became all about trying to operationalize, integrate information we had. So in the 20s through 50s, people had a real strong reaction to Freud, basically. So Freud came in and was like, everything is about these unconscious things in our minds and blah, blah, blah. And you had staunch behaviorists who were like, no, everything needs to be observable, right? Just again, like that activity we were trying to do at the beginning. How do we observe it? And they literally thought of the mind as a black box. They were like, doesn't matter what happens in the mind, it's just observable behavior. That's what we should be studying. When we got to the 60s, people were like, no, it actually matters what people are thinking because that's going to determine their behavior. And so Cattell and Horn were part of this movement, of the cognitive movement, and started to think about how the way we think might influence our intelligence. And so Raymond Cattell and John Horn came up with a different two-factor theory of intelligence. And they argue that there are two different types of intelligence. One is fluid intelligence, which they abbreviated GF. And I think they were taking Spearman's G factor and saying like these are parts of the G, but yeah, why not just call it F? It'd be so much easier for all the rest of us, right? And then crystallized intelligence, or GC. And on the next slide, I'm going to define those for them. All right, so fluid intelligence is essentially nonverbal mental efficiency. It is our ability to solve problems, particularly problems we haven't seen before. And these can be literal math problems, or these can be like a crisis comes up in your life. How are you going to address it? Okay, that's fluid intelligence. Essentially learning, taking skills you've learned and critical thinking ability and all that good stuff, and using it to solve a new issue that's placed in front of you. And as you can see, there's non-verbal aspects to this. Like you don't need to talk it through, you can just sort of do. Crystallized intelligence is more what we tend to think of when we think of intelligence even today, although certainly modern intelligence tests do measure fluid intelligence, but if you just ask someone about intelligence, we tend to think of crystallized, which is things that we have acquired already. So skills that we have learned already, knowledge we have learned already, so facts that we've learned, right? Whether or not those facts are accurate anymore, right? I just think about like stuff I learned about Christopher Columbus in school, right? None of which included that he was a genocidal rapist. Like, that would have been good because this guy that we were like venerating, right? You know, so that's crystallized intelligence. So like stupid stuff we remember. Like I could still sing you the quadratic formula, even though I don't think I've used it since high school, right? But because we had a song for it, it's still up there. It's never going away. So like, you know, that's your crystallized intelligence. And as you can see here from this point, it's highly dependent upon your culture, right? So what is important as crystallized intelligence may vary from culture to culture, right? So for Aboriginal peoples, it might be about the best way to interact with the land and feed yourself and care for nature, right? For people in the US, it's, you know, again, it could depend on where in the US you live, right? Is it about history, right? Or is it about, you know, other things? For other countries, they might value like math and science related facts the most, and that becomes what education really focuses around, right? And not that they're not learning other things, but what's valued, what's taught in your culture is going to affect your crystallized intelligence, even something like the actual facts you learn. So the modern like Wechsler scales, which we'll talk about later, include on them a measure of essentially basic factual knowledge. And it's some stuff that like, if you weren't from here, you might not know, right? Like it asks things like, who is Martin Luther King Jr.? And all of us are like, of course we know that, right? But if you aren't from the US, you may or may not have learned about it, right? So it's important to recognize that, as we talked about previously, there's cultural bias in these tests as well. All right, and then towards the end of the last century, this approach to intelligence was further refined by Carroll and his colleagues. And so there is the Cattell, Horn, Carroll theory, essentially recognizing the influence of those people who came before him. So it's called the CHC theory. And this distinguishes between crystallized knowledge, so that relatively stable, learned knowledge. But then instead of just saying like fluid intelligence, they talked about a multitude of information processing skills, so that it's not like one thing, that we have a whole bunch of different skills as people that allow us to take in information and use it in meaningful ways, right? And that could be solving a problem, or it could be writing an essay, right? Things along those lines. The CHC theory is the basis for a number of current measures, including the Woodcock-Johnson's more recent revisions, and then the CIS is the Cognitive Assessment System. So these are things that are measures that are still used. It just might not be the most popular right now. So just to be even more confusing, some people are like, no, there's more intelligences than just that. And so Spearman's two-factor theory of intelligence, and also the advent of modern statistical techniques that allow us to essentially measure things in different ways, led to the development of several important approaches to intelligence as multidimensional. So the type of statistics that in particular is being used here is what's called factor analysis. And this allows you to take a whole bunch of items. So let's say every item on an intelligence scale, put it into a statistical program, and it'll just group those by how much they relate to each other, essentially by how much they correlate with each other, almost like a reliability type thing. And so from this data, we get a lot of the stuff for like the personality test we'll talk about later in the semester, but people have used it to look at, are there more than just like two types of intelligence? And so J.P. Guilford in the US developed a very complex multidimensional model of intelligence that stimulated thought, but didn't really influence anything else. People were like, this is cool, but it's really complicated. We don't know how to translate this into like an intelligence test, but nice idea, basically. Then Howard Gardner and Robert Stern and others started proposing theories of multiple intelligence that were less complex and therefore got more recognition. And now I'm realizing as I put this up that Garner's model has actually evolved since I first made this, and he has added some competencies. I think he might have 9 now. So let me just Google that really quickly because I want to give you the most up-to-date version. So. I think it's since 2010, but I could be wrong. So yeah, there's at least 8 now. So see if I can just copy this image and add a slide and plop it on there. Yay, okay, cool. So now I'll have this for future times I teach the class. And so the ones that he's added are the naturalist and the intrapersonal and the interpersonal. Okay, so let me just use this slide. So as you can see, these are very specific and they get at things like musical intelligence. So people who have perfect pitch, people who can write music, the rhythm, timbre. So these could be people who end up being musicians or people who end up being like producers, maybe, right? And like your the Matrixes and whoever the hot producers are right now, right? That like make a lot of money producing things. Bodily kinesthetic is essentially like knowledge of your body in space and connecting your mind with your body. So people who are really extraordinary athletes, for example, are said to be high on this. This is sort of what was interrupted for Simone Biles this summer. When she got the twisties, she lost her bodily kinesthetic sense. She didn't know where she was in the air, right? Which, as you can imagine, when you're flipping, you know, like 12 feet in the air, is terrifying. Yeah. Logical mathematical is quantifying things, making hypotheses, working on proving them. So it's really kind of like science-y, essentially. The intra and the interpersonal are about relationships with people. Intra is relationships with yourself, understanding yourself, being aware of your own feelings. And this might sound strange if you've never thought about this, but this is an individual difference variable. There are people who are really bad at understanding what they're feeling emotionally or even physically. So for example, people with eating disorders will sometimes be really bad at being able to tell whether they're actually physically hungry or not, because they've essentially trained themselves not to do that. But then that can translate over into like not recognizing their own emotions as well. Interpersonal is being really good at sensing other people's feelings and motives. So someone who's high in interpersonal intelligence might be a great therapist, but they also might be a really good detective, right? Figuring out when someone's lying to them, that type of thing. Linguistic, finding the right words to express what you mean. So these people might be good orators, but they also might be really good writers, for example. Spatial, being able to visualize the world in 3D, keep like a mental map, right? So they show someone hiking. This might be someone who can like find new ways of traversing, you know, a mountain or something like that. And the naturalist is a new one as well. So a naturalistic intelligence, I guess it would be. And so this is understanding living things and nature. Some people that have a green thumb, for example, right? There are people who are just amazing at naturalistic intelligence, and they might be, you know, world-renowned horticulturalists who make the like crazy gardens that just like always look perfect and beautiful. Or these might be people like, there are people who exist who are horse whisperers, for example, who like just understand horses intuitively. I think it might still be on Netflix. There's a really good documentary called Buck about a guy that like the book The Horse Whisperer is based on. And that shows him just working with horses, and he just understands them intuitively. And it's something most of us would love to have that connection, but just would never have, right? So again, this is taking beyond the idea of like what you know versus problem solving to like, there are lots of different things that are included in intelligence that we might not be recognizing or measuring. And I do have to say, most modern intelligence tests are really kind of only looking at linguistic and logical mathematical still. Yeah.
So I can imagine something like that, as far as like naturalistic, with other things that's like technology. So for example, like a Steve Jobs, so like a Bill Gates, who just understand technology so well that they're not only able to craft and create it, but they're able to mold it, shape it in a way to where it allows them to innovate different types of things that we all the time.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was like, would that be linguistic? Would that be logical mathematical? I guess there could be elements of both to that, right? Because programming is a language, but you have that problem solving aspect. Yeah, I mean, maybe this theory will keep evolving and we will have something like technological, because it is so important to our world and it is so unique, right now. And it's like you need to sort of have the like interpersonal knowledge if you're doing like interfaces. Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like this model. It's like, for example, like people in the school, like just because they're doing that, like not that,
Exactly.
I feel like it's more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't necessarily advocate for this since I did all the school. But there's a TikToker named Daniel Mack, and he goes up to people driving really fancy, expensive cars in the LA area, and he asks them, hey, what do you do for a living? And then he started asking them whether or not they go to college. And a good chunk of these people never went to college because like the skills they needed to do what they particularly do to get rich, they wouldn't have learned in college, right? So again, I'm not saying go drop out and like you'll be driving a sports car, right? Because there are plenty of people who are in like finance and whatnot who do have college degrees that he walks up to. But it does mean that, you know, there are these other forms of intelligence that we're missing in these traditional intelligence tests and in our way of thinking about the way intelligence has to be molded, right? Yeah, I have a friend who stopped after an associate's, and she's just a firm believer that like college just doesn't make sense for some people, right? And certainly if you think about the trades, for example, like yes, you need to do additional training for that, but we tend to sort of like poo-poo it. But like plumbers can make more than me in a year, right? And like I can't just fix my toilet, even though I have a PhD, right? Something goes wrong, we're calling the plumbers, right? And we need to recognize that that is a skill, right? And that is something that should be respected. I think whenever someone has something go wrong, they respect it, right? But not necessarily in our society. All right, so this was really in vogue for the 90s and really up until the early 2000s. And then this started kind of merging with the crystallized and fluid intelligence. But the idea of verbal versus performance IQ, so the linguistic versus the mathematic logic one. So this is David Wechsler, so the guy who came up with the Wechsler intelligence scales. He tended to work with adults, so most of the intelligence measures prior to this really focused on kiddos. And so he came up with like the adult scale, and then that's been adapted to be for kids. And there's actually even a preschool version of that. And in the materials I got donated, I have a WIPSI, which is the preschool one, which I've never owned before. So it's kind of fun to look at it. So I'll make sure I bring that in when we talk about it. So he was really interested in the advances in statistics that allows you to look at things in new ways. And he drew from existing tests for adults, like the Army Alpha and Beta that we talked about before, block design, the picture completion, and other tests that already existed to come up with this new model for intelligence that was really reflected by how you assessed it. And so he came up with this idea of 3 scores. And the first version of his test was the Wechsler-Bellevue. So again, this is older than the 90s, but like his version was really in vogue in the 90s. So this was like a competitor for the Woodcock-Johnson, the Stanford-Binet, things like that. And so it has that full scale IQ, but now it's no longer chronological age and mental age. It's like the sum of all your test scores on this IQ test, basically. And then verbal IQ and performance or nonverbal IQ. So it kind of gets back to the Army Alpha, Army Beta, thinking about people who can write versus people who can, people who can read versus people who can't, but also just thinking about some of these more abstract things. So when we talk about the Wechsler scales, we'll talk about these in a lot of detail. But basically, it was a recognition that not everything in intelligence can be recognized with just like having people write stuff, right, or talk about stuff. And some of the other intelligence tests did that already, but just weren't conceptualizing it in the same way. So it became the model for, as I mentioned, the subsequent forms for children and adults. And so now, though, and really this was like the early 2000s that they started doing this, they now have 4 scales instead of just verbal and performance. And those have adapted. So the WAIS 4 came out in 2009, I want to say, because that was like right at the end of my grad training, and I was like, what do you mean I got to learn a new intelligence scale? Because I've been giving the waste 3 the whole time. And it includes measures of fluid and crystallized intelligence, as well as the traditional verbal performance. So it's starting to recognize some of these other theories that we've been talking about as well. The other way we start to think about intelligence is information processing models. So these focus on the ways that we represent and process information. So they attempt to measure different operations that are performed, so more of that fluid intelligence, rather than that crystallized intelligence of just like information we've previously learned. So the Woodcock-Johnson that I've already mentioned, and they have a cognitive subscale, and then the cognitive ability scale. And this is based on a theory of just human ways of thought that was developed in the 70s and has kind of adapted since then. That's based on the idea of a human mind being like a computer, basically. That we process things just like, you know, not in an identical way, but it's similar to the way computers process information. Humans over time have tended to conceptualize how we think based on the technology that exists. So I think as our technology keeps adapting, these theories will keep adapting as well. Certainly as we get more into AI, I think it will really inform how we think about human intelligence. So a little bit of sum up here. We've defined this lots of different ways over time. And again, it's still adapting, it's still changing. And it has been operationalized in many different ways on these various tests, right? So the way that we actually measure it. And some have been more influential than others. As we talked about, you know, the really complex model of multiple intelligences, people were like, no, we're good, Guilford, right? Like, that's a nice idea, right? And so some of them, it's been based on the evidence. I think some of it it's been based on like what makes sense in the context of the current thinking, right? So that has influenced it. And then each approach furthers our understanding. So starting Monday, we're going to talk about the Wechsler scales, which are kind of considered the gold standard in this day and age. And then we'll also talk about the Binet scales, which used to exist, and some of the other scales as well. And then, like I said, a week from today, y'all will get the chance to give each other some neuropsych type assessments, which we will also talk about next week as well. Alrighty, so actually, I'm gonna let y'all out 5 minutes early or so. So enjoy your weekend. Bye, Zoom people. Also have a good weekend.